Hello, and welcome to Family Matters, a joint production of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family and the University of the District of Columbia. I'm Allen Blakey, your host. The purpose of this series is to talk about how families act and interact, the challenges and issues they face, and to hear useful ideas about managing family relationships. And when we talk about families, we don't mean just nuclear families, though that is the starting point. Over the course of the series, we're looking at many types of relationships, workplace, community, and others, where family-type dynamics come into play. My guest for this segment is Louise Rauseo, a registered nurse and psychotherapist who has been a member of the faculty of the Bowen Center since 1990. Ms. Rauseo lived in El Paso for 5 years, developing and teaching in programs on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border as part of the Center for the Study of Natural Systems and the Family. She has specialized in how families adapt to immigration and dramatic social change. She continues to divide her time researching and teaching at the Bowen Center and at the Center in El Paso, while also maintaining a practice in family psychotherapy in Annapolis, Maryland. Our topic today is resilience, understanding and overcoming adversity in families. Children in families struggling with poverty, lack of education, or drugs and alcohol face particularly difficult emotional and developmental challenges. But everyone is different, and different people have different responses to stress. Some children show resilience in the face of adversity. Today we'll talk about how adversity affects emotional and personal development and what research shows about the ability of some children and adults to cope with it. Welcome.
Thank you. That was very, very complete there.
So let's start with what resilience is. That's our topic today. Can you give us a little bit of a feel for what we're going to be talking about?
Well, I've thought about it as this natural process that allows people to bounce back from difficult things, from severe trauma, from stress, adversity in a very broad sense, and how we are different in that. Some of us bounce back better than others.
And I guess it's no surprise that we're all different, but and some are more negatively affected than others by their environment. But most people probably don't know what some of the research shows about factors that can make a difference.
Well, I think one of the things that's been interesting, I bet 15 years ago, I first heard about some of the research with a group that started in 1955 in Hawaii. They captured the ability to study a whole group in a small community of 600 people born in 1955. And they followed that group through different stages. They looked at them at age 10, 18, 30, 32, 36 to see of those who had higher risk, what happened.
When you say higher risk, born in some of the difficult conditions we mentioned at the opening, poverty, lack of education, drugs, alcohol.
They really looked at those they considered really high risk were those who had at least 4 of those things: poverty, some kind of stress at birth,
meaning physical stress
around the birth, or they were low birth weight, or they had some kind of disability. They had, in addition to that, they had some kind of problem in the family, either parents with severe problems of mental illness or alcoholism. And the other thing that was striking was that the educational level of the mother, even more than the father, made a difference. So that if the educational level of mother was quite low, and they had the poverty.
Didn't graduate from high school.
Didn't graduate from high school, for example. And the poverty and these other things, that group would be considered high risk. And so out of their group, they figured about a third of the population was high risk in that
And your
group.
deck is really stacked against you if you said 4 of these characteristics.
That's what they were saying. And I think most people expected that with that that beginning, that the majority would end up with really severe problems. But the facts turned out to be a little different in the research. And this has been followed up. There's a group in Baltimore that was studied with very similar results, that instead of this being real general, only about a third of that high-risk group had long-term problems.
Oh, and the other two-thirds?
They bounced back. They were resilient in many different ways, but that by the time they hit adulthood, and responsible adulthood, they were talking, from 30 on, something like that, they could see that they were really substantially effective adults.
And it's not just growing up. It's not just because you carry these traumas that you inherit or in your family early on, in many cases.
Yeah, they showed some difference in that group. One of the things that was interesting is that although they talked about the things that were successful, and they talked, I think, that real success for these adults had to do with relationships that worked, particularly marriages, work success, that they were able to get educated enough and continue to work with vigor. And what was the other piece that, as parents, they were pretty effective. So that would be the things you think might be problems for people.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to have a tough time in life, then you would probably have bad relationships and not be successful at work or parenting.
Yeah. Well, people got divorced, but no greater numbers than the general average in the world. And they had some problems with kids, but nothing significant as you might expect. They were lower in some of these things than the average in the young adults of that, or 30, whatever that is, young adult age. So they were doing amazingly well. They were very, very dedicated to work. And the one area that stress showed up, well, two areas, in their work systems, they would get very, very, they'd get into a tangle in the work relationships. They wanted to do it themselves. They wanted to figure it out. They were, I think, at that point used to figuring out how to make life work.
Were these the ones who were more successful, even though they came from high risk?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So they tend to they've learned how to do things for themselves.
Exactly. I'll do it myself, thank you. And that created a certain amount of stress for them at work. They got through it, but it was more stressful than it might have been for somebody else.
So it would be considered overall a successful working situation, even though they may have had some.
Had felt. And the other thing that they showed was more physical ailments related to stress. Nobody died of them, but there was more evidence that whatever they used to overcome these things, they paid a little price. So it wasn't all, it's not just completely rosy, but that overall the success is significant, and especially given what they started with. So that would, it's just not colored completely rosy, but pretty amazing anyway.
And I see you brought your book about the Hawaiian experience.
This is one of the classic studies, one of the earliest long-term longitudinal studies. When you get a study that goes 30 to 40 years, you have some pretty significant information. And this is just easily available, called Overcoming the Odds, and it's by the two of the researchers, Emmy Warner and Ruth Smith. But I think this is it's just easily available.
And these researchers followed these children for X number?
30-some years. They're institutions, and they did.
Okay.
So that I don't know that they were all...
And they were writing from the perspective of 30-some years later.
Right. So I think, the thing that got me started, got me curious about this, is that there's been a lot of press given to how people react to trauma. And of course, wartime, a number of other things. And so we have all the concerns about the post-traumatic stress. And then there's disasters, there's hurricanes, and there's earthquakes, and there's things that take you beyond the everyday life struggles. And a lot of concern that we have to do something for this,
Right.
all the population of people who are struggling.
Because these are real problems,
They are
real
real problems.
traumas, but, and it's not just one's constitutional makeup. It's not just they're strong, they're lucky.
Apparently not. And this is the thing that got me curious, because I thought the idea that everybody needs therapy if you've encountered adversity of some kind didn't make sense in relation to the people that I've seen clinically.
From your own experience.
From my experience, from working at the border, from a number of different places. So I got curious about what is it that allows people to help overcome some of these things. And I think a lot of the researchers are saying there's not just one thing. There's several things. Now, there may be a constitutional thing. One of the things they talk about is that in a whole family, you might, if you have 4, 5, 6 kids, there may be one that gets into more of these problems throughout a lifetime. They have the same parents, they have the same poverty, they have the same events surrounding them. But what is it that one ends up with more difficulty? Some of the questions have to do with, how does this kid become the one that people worry about more, that the teachers worry about, parents worry about?
The lightning rod.
Lightning rod is a good word. And then they talk about projection. The worry goes to one automatically. And there's some question about what makes a lightning rod in a family.
So does that typically happen, that a troubled family will, or maybe, I don't know if it's the cause or the effect, that a troubled family will have one child that's particularly troubled? Or is that not the rule?
It happens a lot. But the thing that's interesting is that in these families, if they were, say, fighting a lot of conflict in the marriage, for example, if there was not one kid targeted as the one that the family would focus on, they just sort of slipped through. The fight went on between the parents, and there wasn't a big deal.
It didn't seem to have as much effect on the kids.
Not nearly as much effect. If one got singled out, it seemed to make a big difference. There was a little line that I thought was interesting about these kids would be called impinged if they got more of that negative attention.
If they were the lightning rod.
However, they said if it was given out equally among the kids, it's like they just sort of rolled through it. So it wasn't just the difficulties in the parents, but it was the way it interacted with a particular child.
So if the mom and dad are fighting, even intensely, a lot of the time, but they're not picking on or bringing any of the kids into their fight, it can be better for the kids in the long run.
Isn't that interesting? And then one of the things they talk about in the literature is how do you train families not to do that? Well, that's a good question. But that wasn't part of the research yet. But they were seeing that there might be a temperamental thing. One of the things they talked about is that the kids who seem to bounce out of this and don't have too much trouble have a temperament that invites praise, and they seem to be able to kind of scoot around and get along with everybody from the time they're really, really young. So they attract some positive attention.
That can be tough in a really troubled, with all of these factors against you.
Some people are really clever, though. If you think about, how many, I don't know if you see that with children, but there are some who just know how. I had one really priceless story, because we had 2 adopted kids, and our daughter was adopted. She was 3 months old, and she was a charmer. She had charmed the people in the place where she had been first, and they wanted her to have a placement, so they quickly brought her where she could get placed. And she said, I was just smart. I knew what was good for me.
She said that, remembering even at that young age.
So I think there's something about, that's the question nobody knows. What is temperament, really?
Yeah, that sounds like the Constitution.
And it's not clear how much that's an interaction between the child and the events surrounding them. But those things, plus that piece about not focusing on one kid that gets to be the lightning rod seems to be some of the factors that make it possible for someone to bounce back.
And on this show, we have talked about triangles from time to time. That is a key concept in Bowen theory, right?
Yeah.
And how natural it is for two people, when tensions rise in their relationship, to reach out for the third leg of the stool, to reach out for it's almost like an attempt to grab some kind of anchor, but then that transfers the negative emotion, and then you can get a triangular circle where the tensions just keep shifting in the... And so what you're saying here is that apparently if the parents are struggling but they don't triangulate with one of their kids, then that gives the kids a better chance.
There's another such thing as flexible triangles, where the triangle doesn't stay fixed in one or two relationships, but it seems to move around through the family, and that moves the tension.
Oh, okay. So there could be different kids could be singled out at different times in this parent-kid, but if it's shared,
if it gets passed around, there's a lot of flexibility in it, and it seems to be it's not described in the research as Bowen theory, but it's describing things that are concepts of Bowen theory. It's so interesting. So that the other thing they talk about is that the structure of the family that can really make a difference is that if there are 4 or less children in the family, and there's not these really close births where they're less than 2 years apart, that family group is probably going to do better. They're going to have more resilience.
So fewer and more space between children
seems to make a difference.
Helpful.
Yeah.
I wonder why that is.
I don't know, unless you think about, family with 8. One of the families they reported had 8 children, and there was one in that seemed to be the one that the tension went to. There would be a lot of tension with poverty and 8 kids, and a lot of instability.
I guess if you're in poverty, the more kids, the less to go around, and it gets worse.
Maybe less energy, too, for the parents. So those were some of the pieces. The other thing what I thought was fascinating is that if these kids manage to be connected and stay connected, first of all, if they had a stable connection in the family and didn't get a parent die or leave before they were a year old, that was a good prognosis for them. But the other thing was that if the kids themselves learned how to reach out to a grandparent or aunts and uncles or a teacher or a coach or somebody, they had a much better chance to bounce back.
To find an adult to help them along.
So they kind of some of these kids took things in their own hands at some point, and they just weren't victims of the circumstances. But it's so interesting to think, what is a kid that will do that? And walk around somehow and figure out, I have to go here, I have to go there, to find the resources that will help me. So that's been, I think, one of the interesting findings they've reported for a long time.
Do you think social service agencies are aware of this kind of research when they deal with troubled families or poverty level families? Do they try to find one-on-one mentor type adult relations? That's hard to do though with a family.
It is hard, but I think people are more and more aware of it, and I hear about programs that try and integrate some of these ideas. I think that the piece that's missing is a way of understanding this in the broadest sense possible as part of the family emotional process that comes down generations, and that there would be, I think, a wisdom in the agencies if they have that, as well as just the research, if they have a sense of how that fits into the generational stuff. One of the people that I had talked to a long time says, we didn't know we had generational information that was going to help us. And I think that's so true. People don't know that. So I think that the agencies may be it's getting to be, the resilience literature is getting to be huge. And it's focused in educational programs, but also I think in social service.
Are schools trying to do more to
There are some schools
intervene?
are picking up on it and seeing that the mentor or some of these other things is what they can do. I don't think they're, they don't have the time, they don't have the all of the resources to really get into the family thing. And what I hear in the social services is that people are overstretched. What I think is so interesting, that if people are trying to provide therapy for all of these, rather than looking at the already existing resilience
mechanisms
within the family, it may not be the wisest use of resources. But if people can see that there's already something there that you might be able to tap into, I think that can be really positive.
Yeah. Let's go back to the factors that can make it worse. You said when one kid is picked on.
Yeah.
Does that make it bad for everybody, or does that make it, in these long-term studies, or does that make it bad for that one kid in particular?
That one kid in particular. That's pretty clear. And the others may be scooting out from under a
They
little
may
bit.
not be too affected by it, but it's not necessarily bad news for everybody.
No,
It's
I'm
tough for
sure.
the one kid who gets the.
Yeah, I'm sure, as I hear from families, that somebody who's in a family where some of the kids are getting into real trouble, or one, that the other siblings are aware and wish it were different, but they're not really in the position to figure out what to do about it.
Siblings probably, maybe it's different in every family, but siblings probably typically don't know how to.
Most of the time wouldn't have a clue.
Well, the younger wouldn't know how to help the older.
Right.
The older might feel like it's not my problem, it's the younger one's problem. I don't know.
Well, sometimes older kids will get involved in that, but without the effectiveness of being able to really change things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the rest of the family gets off a little bit easier when there is one that gets caught in that.
Now, you've spoken at conferences and reported, if I'm saying this right, that a child has influence on its environment just as the environment has influence on a child? Can you help us explain
that is true. I think what I think that has to do with is that it's hard for us to realize, but from the time this kid is probably able to smile and coo, there's an interaction with child and parents, or whomever is caring for this child. And that a child that is able to do that is more likely to elicit something positive. The child that doesn't have that capacity may be in for more trouble.
This goes back to the lucky kid who's got the outgoing temperament, the charmer,
something like that.
The social skills, or maybe not social skills, but some kind of ability to relate. And
some inner connection. And that may not be, that may be something that is built in even in the pregnancy. Who knows? I mean, the facts of life have an influence on that. But I think the thing that Dr. Bowen talked about was that it's easy to forget that very early this child is participating in the process, whether it's being the lightning rod. You see kids that somehow manage to get themselves up in the front of the classroom in trouble almost every time.
Mm-hmm.
So they're a part of it. It doesn't mean they're to blame. Does that make sense?
Right. We're not blaming anyone here. We're talking about behavior and
things that
trying to find causes of behavior, not judging behavior.
No, and I think it's not even that you can separate cause and effect so clearly in this, but you can see that there's participation in many different ways. Yeah.
And back to the other point about if the parents stay in the relationship with the child through the child's first year, how did you say that? What was the key there?
Well, that was the research said that if they if the connection is there for the first year, there's not the death of a parent, the loss of a parent, or parents too depressed to relate, or something like that.
Which would be, as long as there's not some kind of cutoff in the relationship.
Yeah.
If there's a consistent, through at least the first year, that's a substantial
And it could be the
helper.
the grandparent could be that person. I mean, it doesn't have to be the mother or the father.
Some
but
adult.
some adult that's steady.
From essentially birth through the first year, who's a substantial presence in a continuing presence in the first year.
That seems to be really a big piece. And then beyond that, there are many other pieces in terms of the consistency.
So some children appear to have a way to reduce the negative effects of their environment, and that may be genetic, that may be passed down generation to generation. I guess if it's a very young child that's exhibiting these characteristics, it has to be almost biological, doesn't it?
Well,
or can
that's
that be
the
even
question. That's the question I think that
behavior?
Bowen was getting at, is that it looks like it might be biological, but that there's this interactive process from very early on.
There's enough that we don't know about early learning, so that we can't say for sure that it's not.
Yeah, right. That it's more likely a mixture. One of the things they did find is that in adoptive families, if the history of that biological family and the adoptive family has something real negative, like antisocial behavior or schizophrenia or something, and has both, there's a much bigger chance of problems.
Great.
So are we running down time?
Yeah, we're getting toward the end, but we're going to talk about this in another segment. And
That'll
thank
be
you
good.
very much
Sure.
for being on the
Okay.
show and helping us understand more about how to get out of adversity. I think everyone's interested in that.
Okay.
If you would like more information on our topic or would like to learn more about the services offered at the Bowen Center, please visit our website at www.thebowencenter.org or contact us by telephone at 202-965-4400. Thank you for watching. I hope this program has been educational and fun. I invite you to join me for the next edition of Family Matters. I am Allen Blakey, and your family does matter.